Hello everyone and welcome back to another video and welcome back to the channel. In today's video we're going to be continuing on building out the app that we created in the previous videos. In the last video we built out this, started passing the data from the master view controller through to the detail view controller. So we focused on building out the profile, circular profile image, the title of the character and the character bio. So the remaining part is this collection view at the bottom, which will be the comic book covers. So that's our intention, is to, in today's video, is do the networking side of that. And then in the final video, we'll be actually populating the images into where those purple blocks are. So if you missed the last video or any of the other videos, or you're just stopping by here for the very first time, I'm going to put all the links to the videos in the description below. And like I say, if this is your first time checking out the channel, or you have yet to subscribe, please subscribe to the channel and turn on post notifications so that you can be notified of when I am uploading new content. So yeah, let's jump into today's tutorial. We are to save some time, I've already built out the models that we will be getting back from Marvel, and if you haven't signed up to the Marvel endpoint, I'll put the developer.marvel.com website. I'll put the link to the description to that below. We are going to be using this API today. This one, let's expand that. So yeah, we're going to be, and which basically fetches us a list of comics. So I have built that up here. So this is the kind of JSON response that we will get from Marvel, and I've been based on this JSON response. In results, which is an array, I've been able to build the models out that we want to use. So I have created 3 Swift files. The first one is a struct. It's called comic, and it adheres to the codable protocol. And I have a list of attributes or properties in here. Let ID of type int. Let title of type string, description, issue number, and page count. I'm not actually going to use in this demonstration, but there's ideas there that you could, in the actual app itself, you could then click on the comic and it will push you through to another detail view and give you information specifically about that comic. So I've added that in there as like a little pointer for people to go on and have a play around and see what they can produce. And so yeah, we've got let description of type string, let issue number of type int, and let page count of type int. Those 3 aren't used in this demonstration, but yeah, there's ideas on how you can make this app a little bit better. And then finally, line 17 is let cover is of type thumbnail, which is of our custom type object. And then 19 to 22 is using the coding keys. Again, we've touched on coding keys in part 2, which is appearing up at the top now. If you want to go and check that out, feel free to do that. But coding keys, if we look at our JSON response and we scroll down to find thumbnails, which is here, thumbnail. So there's an attribute in the JSON response called thumbnail, and we have not called our property in our model thumbnail. We've called it cover. So basically coding keys is saying you call it thumbnail from the server, please can you bind thumbnail to our custom property called cover, and that's all coding keys do. But again, I've touched on that in part 2 of this video series. Then we have, if we just move to the next file, we have another struct called comic based data, adheres to codable, and in this one we have a response code and something called API data source, which is of a custom type called comic book data source, and response code is of type int. And again, we're using the coding keys because Marvel don't use response code or API data source. They call it code and data. So we're just saying, can you map to those? So if we scroll up to the top, so we are actually going to get the code. So 200, 400, 404, 403, 500, whatever. So we're going to use that attribute and the data attribute, which actually gets us access to the properties inside. So on line 13, as you can see, we have got a attribute or property called API data source, and that is of type comic book data source. So if we jump into there now, that is one of our own, and it's just a struct of type codable, and we have a property called comics, which is an array of our comic model, which I showed you at the beginning of our walkthrough here. And again, we're using coding keys because comics doesn't exist in the response from Marvel. It's called results, and as you can see here, we have results. So yeah, I've added those 3 files. So yeah, feel free to pause the video at any point and copy those out, because I'm not going to be typing them out again. And also I've added in the assets folder, I've added a placeholder image, and it's 3 pictures based on the screen resolution. It's 3 images of Iron Man's face, and they are going to represent the default placeholder image in our collection view. So if there's an error unwrapping our comic cover, if there's a just an error in general, or we need a preloader or something like that, we're going to use that as our placeholder. So with that in mind, we will now make a start on writing some code. So we're going to in our request handler, we are going to basically pretty much do exactly the same as our get characters. So I'll get characters, but we're going to call this one get comics. And we need to pass in an ID of type integer. And if I line all that lot up like so, that's all good. And we need to make a change to this endpoint 24. So if we head on back to Marvel and we look at the API, the endpoint that we're going to call, so we have v1/public/characters/character ID. So now we need to add a slash, and then this is where our ID that we pass in to this function is going to get called, or is going to get used, sorry. So we need to do that, then /, and then finally comics, like so. So that endpoint will look something very similar to the one that we have up here. So if I copy and paste that in here, like so, our URL will look something like that, because our base URL, so if we decide we go through line 26, so when we're building up our URL, we have base URL, which is we set up here on line 12, plus our endpoint, which is this one here, and then we have to do this. We have to do our build query string. So basically that's a combination of a timestamp, an API key, our public one, which you get from Marvel, and then a hash. All of these functions and all of this is covered in part 2, so I really advise you to go and check out part 2 of this video series. And that's all we need for this get comics now. Now we need to head on over to our collection views data source, which at the moment we're just passing through 20 cells. So as you can see on line 17, in our number of items in section, we are just returning 20 cells. So that's why we've got a static number of 20 cells. So we're going to make those changes now. So we need 2 variables. well, one variable and one closure. Our variable is going to be called comic book data. Are we going to say this is called comics data? Call that comics data, and this is going to be of type comic base data. And then we need a var, and then reload collection view, like so. And this is our closure. So we need, we need an error. We need to pass in an error here, and our return is void, like that. Now we can create our function that actually goes and calls our request to go and fetch the data. So fetch comic, we'll call it fetch comics, and we need to pass in the ID, which will get forwarded onto the request, like so. And then we need to do let request equals request handler, and then we should have a function called get comics, and then we pass in the ID, and then we're going to use our JSONDecoder extension .decode with request, and the type that we're expecting back is of type comic base data .self, and then request, and then here we do result and error. And one other thing I want to add is weak self to stop any retain cycles that potentially could happen if let weak self. Now we're going to try and unwrap self to make sure that it's not nil. You could add, you could do else, and just print something out for now. Print error. I'll just put a comment there. We're not going to print out anything there, but print error. It wouldn't be error. It would be print unable to unwrap. Unable to unwrap. Something like that. So in weak self, we need weak self dot comics data equals result. So basically, we are just binding the result from our request to our comics data that is on line 13. And once that's done, we need to then just trigger an event to say, hey, we've got our data and hopefully there's no error. Go and reload our collection view. So here we'll do weak self dot reload collection view, and this is optional, and it takes in an error. So that error should be nil, and that's going to complain because we need to make that an optional in our on line 14. And that is pretty much all that needs to happen in our data source, in our collection view data source for this collection view in the character details section. So now we need to go and head on over to our custom UI table view cell where we initialize our data source. So there we need to do something like data source dot reload collection view, and then in there equals, and then open and close curly braces, and then we do weak self again to handle the retain cycles. We are expecting an error, and then do in. So in this section we'll do again if let weak self equals self, and then comma error equals nil. So basically if our error is nil and we can unwrap self, which in this instance probably very unlikely that it's going to be nil, But our error should be nil because we should get data. So weak self or self in this closure should not, very unlikely, be nil, or should not be nil. You could use unowned in that instance. I'm going to go into unowned self and weak self in a dedicated video because it needs some to be defined. So it's not outside the scope of this, but we'll go into it in more detail. So yeah, if let weak self equals self, so if we can unwrap self, it's not nil, and if our error is equal to nil, from as in the error we get from the response, then we can pretty much guarantee that we can reload our table, our collection view. Else, here you would print out some sort of an alert, or you could trigger a closure that would fire alert somewhere else. Alert. So I'm just going to leave it at that for now, but I will print out something to say sad times something went wrong. And then here we need to do weak self dot collection view dot reload data. There you go. And basically what that's doing is, if that if condition is true, then we will reload the data, and that means that when we reload the data, you'll see all the comic book covers appear. But for now, for this video, we're just focusing on the networking side. I'm going to print message here. So something like print, yay, we reloaded our comic covers. So yeah, that we won't see it happen in our UI, but we'll trigger that closure. So now, with that in mind, we need to actually pass in the in our data source. We actually need to pass in our character ID. So because we are only returning in this particular table view, in our character detail table view, we're only going to pass in one cell for the comics. If you were doing this loads of times, you really wouldn't do it this way. Because we know we've got this is kind of a static table view, other than the fact that we are going to make a request to get data for the comics. So we know, we pretty much guarantee every time we load this view, we're going to have 3 sections. And every time, we're only going to want one section in that table view. One cell, sorry, one row in that section. So here, because we already have access to our character, which we in our cells.setData we are already doing, we could do and this cell actually has access to our data source. So we do cell dot actually no, we're going to go into the cell itself. So if we go into our character collection view, which I think is this one, character image, yeah, we're going to have a trigger, func trigger, I'm in the wrong, I want this one. So we're going to have I was in the wrong cell. I was in the collection view cell. I need to be in the table view cell. So func trigger data source, like so. And we're going to take in a character, and that's of type character, like that. And then we need to do a data source dot fetch comics, and then we'll pass in the character ID here. So character dot ID, and that's going to complain because it's expecting an optional. But what we can do here is do guard let ID equals character dot ID, and then if that fails, we will print out failed to unwrap character in the table view cell, like so. And then in there, instead of using character.id, we're just going to use ID. Then, oh, and I need to return out of that as well, like so. So basically, what we're going to do is we're going to call this function from our table view here. So in our character detail data source, which is this table view here, we're going to call cell.trigger probably have to build it. Yeah, so while that's building, I'll quickly run through what we're going to do. So back in our character detail data source, we'll call that trigger function, which we've just created here. Because it's a public function within that custom cell which we have here, and we need to make that as so yeah, so we've now doing that, we've now made it, we now have access to that custom function that we've created. So we're going to do character detail data source. In there we've created our cells, which you already see, and it has our collection view in. So we do cell.trigger data source and pass in our character, which is there. And I don't think I made that one optional in when we create the function. Let me just move to that cell. That one there, down the bottom. Yeah. So we do that. Make that like that. Cool. So let's walk through this. So in our character detail data source, which is the data source that holds all of this UI. So all of this UI here is we created. We have because it's a table view, we have a data source. So that data source has 3 sections. So this top one, this middle one, character bio. The top one is the profile, where it holds the profile image. The middle one, section 1, or because it's 0 index, it'll be 0, 1, 2. So section 1, or character bio, is a custom table view cell, and the comics section at the bottom is a custom table view cell. So on lines 35, we are initializing that custom table view cell, and it is of type character comic book table view cell. And then on line 36, we just call the function that we've just created. If we build that, that should disappear. If we head on into here, we have this into our custom cell. We have a trigger data source, which basically is we unwrap our character ID. The character is the object that we pass into the function. We unwrap that on lines 66. If that fails, for now, we are just presenting something to the console. And then on line 70, because we've already initialized our data source, we will call fetch comics, which basically will make the request with the ID that we pass in, and everything should work. So with that in mind, let's just check, make sure everything's good. One last thing I do need to do is do dispatch queue.main.async here, because like I covered in part 2, is when we make our request, everything's done on the background. Let's just tidy that up. Everything's done on the background thread, and this dispatch main.async will just bring it all back to the main thread, because reload data, because it's part of the UI, will actually have to be done on the main thread. So hopefully that will cover everything that we need to do in today's video. So if we just stop that build and run it again, we're hoping to see that all our request works correctly, and we actually see, yay, we reloaded our comic covers. So if we drill down into this guy, and it does. If you look here, we have, yay, we reloaded our comic covers. So just to check, just to clarify that does work, we will now actually change out our return 20. So if we do comics data dot API data source dot comics dot count, if that fails, we'll do return 0. But now at the moment, as you can see, we are that's like so. As you can see, we are returning 20 items, and if we now return and build and run, we should see the those 20 items change, and we shouldn't have 20 items, we should have a lot less. Well, it depends on the character, but yeah, hopefully when we do that, yeah, see, we now only have 20 comic books, only 3 comic books in this instance, but we were having 20. So that's probably enough for today, but yeah, it's just another refresher of covering the network and closures and reloading and what have you. But hopefully you've enjoyed the video again today. The next video we will actually be using putting the images in these purple blocks and using our placeholder images, and we'll be replacing this static text that we've put there with the actual title of the comic book. But now we've got all the data and we're actually reloading the data. We just have to, the next video should be super simple. It's just creating a set data function and updating the relevant information. But yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed today's video. And if you have, don't forget to subscribe. And if you're, like I said at the beginning of the video, if you're coming here for the very first time and you've not seen any of the previous videos, please, all the links will be in the description below. Please feel free to check them out. Anyway, that's enough of my waffle for today. I hope you have a wonderful Sunday, and I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.